The pine needles are soft beneath your feet, and the forest around you is so quiet you can hear your own breath. Somewhere ahead, through the silver dark between the trees, something moves, unhurried, certain, belonging completely to this place. The moon is full and low, and its light falls in long, pale strips across the moss. You are not lost. You were led here. The figure ahead moves between the trees without sound. No leaf falls. She passes through the forest the way moonlight passes through water, present, complete, disturbing nothing. Her name is Artemis. She does not know you are here. Or perhaps she does, and has decided it does not matter. She has larger things to hold in her attention tonight. The forest is Arcadia, though it could be any forest. Pine and shadow and cold stone. The smell of wet earth and resin. A stream running somewhere nearby, low and steady, its voice just beneath the silence. This is her world. She was given it long ago, and she has kept it carefully. The way someone keeps something they genuinely love. But tonight, something in that world is not as it should be. She does not need to walk far to find it. The disturbance is old now, several days old, but it leaves a mark on her forests, the way a stone leaves a mark on still water. The ripples have not yet settled. A deer is dead. A deer that should not be dead. It was one of hers, not the great silver deer that ran beside her, not those, but a creature of her forests nonetheless. A doe that had moved through these trees for years, unhurried and sacred, known to the forest and protected by it. A hunter killed it. He did not know what he was killing, perhaps. He may not have known. But he boasted afterward, and that was the part that mattered. He stood over the animal and spoke words he should not have spoken, and the words carried, and they reached her. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, commander of a fleet gathering itself at Aulis on the Aegean coast, preparing to sail east toward Troy. He had sailed the fleet there with great confidence. Great noise. The bronze of 10,000 weapons catching the morning light. He had marched his armies to the water's edge and set them in their ships and waited for the wind. The wind had not come. She had stopped it, not with fury, not with the crack and flash of divine anger, though those were available to her. She had simply withdrawn the air. She had let the sails fall slack and stay that way. She had let the sea go flat and heavy and unmoving, and she had waited, as she was very good at waiting, to see what would be done. And now, across the sea, the Greek fleet sat. It had been sitting for days. The ships rocked gently in the still water, going nowhere. The men were restless. The provisions were not unlimited. Agamemnon had sent for oracles, as kings do when things do not go according to plan, and the oracles had told him the truth, as oracles sometimes do, and the truth was not comfortable. The goddess was displeased. The goddess required a payment. Artemis moved through the forest and did not hurry. The trees thinned ahead of her, opening onto a ridge of pale rock above a valley. She stopped there at the edge and looked out. The moon was full above her. Below, the valley was dark and still and fragrant with cold pine. She had not decided yet. That was the honest truth of it, though the oracles had already spoken. Though the demand had already been named, though somewhere at Aulis Agamemnon was reading the oracle's words by torchlight, and feeling the particular dread of a man who has discovered that the price of something is higher than he expected. The oracles had said what they had said because it was true. She had not arranged it differently. The demand was real, and yet Artemis stood at the ridge and looked out at the valley below, and something in her was very quiet, not calm exactly, not satisfied, something more complicated than either of those things. She had learned, in all her long years among the mountains and forests, that the world very rarely offered a simple answer. There was what was right, and there was what was required, and those were not always the same thing, and sometimes they crossed in ways that made the path difficult to see. Agamemnon had a daughter. Her name was Iphigenia. She was young. She had done nothing wrong. She had not boasted over any deer. She had not stood in any field with blood on her hands and pride in her voice. She was simply the daughter of a man who had done those things, and the world, in its old and sometimes merciless way, had decided that she was the payment. Artemis did not move for a long time. The valley below breathed slowly. An owl called from somewhere in the pines and then went quiet. The stream moved over its stones. She was older than most of the gods, though she appeared young. She had been present at the beginning of the Olympian world. She had watched things take shape that were still taking shape now, playing out across generations of mortals who did not know they were part of patterns laid down long before their grandparents were born. She understood patterns. She had never loved them. The air above Aulis would stay still. The fleet would not move until what was required was given. That was true, and it would remain true. And the king at the water's edge would eventually have no other choice but to do what he was told. She already knew how it would end. She already knew what she would do when the moment came. The answer had been forming in her since before the oracle spoke, since before the deer fell, since before Agamemnon had opened his mouth and said what he said. But she would not reveal it yet, not to the king, not to the oracle, not to anyone standing at the shore in the windless air, watching the sails hang limp and heavy against the mast. Artemis turned from the ridge and walked back into the trees. The forest received her without sound. The moon moved behind a cloud, and the valley went darker still, and the fleet at Aulis rocked slowly in the flat water, and the night continued, and she moved through it, patient and unhurried, carrying what she knew. The days at Aulis did not improve. The men had been there long enough now that the smell of the camp had changed. Salt and wood smoke at first, then something heavier underneath. The particular weight of men waiting for something that would not come. Provisions counted and recounted. Water rationed. Arguments rising and settling like small fires, never fully extinguished. Agamemnon knew what he had to do. The oracle had been clear. The price had been named with precision, which was in some ways worse than vagueness. Vagueness left room. Precision did not. He had sent for her. That was the part the tale holds on to most carefully. That he sent for her. That he wrote to his wife Clytemnestra and said the words that were not true, that a great marriage had been arranged, that their daughter Iphigenia was to be wed to Achilles, the finest warrior on the plain. Come quickly, bring her to Aulis. The fleet waits. Clytemnestra believed him. Why would she not? He was her husband. He was the king. Iphigenia believed him too. She had never had any reason not to. The journey from Mycenae to Aulis was not long. 3 days, perhaps. The roads were dry. The sky was clear inland, away from that strange dead air on the coast. Iphigenia rode in a cart with her mother and looked out at the olive trees along the road and thought about what it would mean to be the wife of Achilles. She was young enough to find the thought mostly pleasant. She arrived at the shore on a morning when the flat water reflected the sky without any wrinkle or disturbance. The ships were enormous. She had not expected them to be so numerous. They filled the harbour in rows, rocking almost imperceptibly in water, too still to properly move them. The camp smelled of smoke and salt, and something else, waiting perhaps. Long waiting. Clytemnestra helped her daughter down from the cart, looked around at the soldiers and the ships and the windless air, and something in her face changed. Quietly, a tightening around the eyes. The particular expression of a woman who has begun to understand that the words she was told and the situation she has arrived at do not correspond. She asked questions. The answers came slowly, and then, not slowly, but all at once, the way bad news sometimes arrives, held back until it can no longer be contained. There was no wedding. There had never been a wedding. The altar was already prepared. Iphigenia stood at the edge of the shore and looked at the water and at the ships and at her father's face, which could not quite meet her eyes, and she understood. They say she did not weep immediately. They say her first response was stillness, a long and very complete stillness, the way a deer stands in the forest before it decides which way to run. Then she spoke. She asked her father if it was true. He could not say it was not. The procession to the altar was slow. The ground between the camp and the place of sacrifice was not far, perhaps 100 steps, perhaps fewer, but each step had a particular weight. She wore white. Someone had thought to prepare white garments, which was either tenderness or cruelty, and there is no knowing now which was intended. The altar was stone, plain and low and practical in the way that altars for sacrifice generally were, not grand, not ornate. The fire had been laid, the priests were present. Everything was in order in the way that things arranged in advance are always in order, each element prepared. Each person positioned, the whole machinery of the event assembled, and waiting only for the last piece to arrive. The last piece had arrived. Iphigenia walked. She did not run. She did not call out. There is something in her walk, in every telling of this story, that carries a weight beyond her years. A gravity. As though in those 100 steps she moved through something and came out older on the other side. The soldiers stood in rows on either side. Their faces were not unkind. Several of them looked at the ground. Agamemnon stood near the altar. His face was the face of a man who has convinced himself that what he is doing is necessary, and who has perhaps partly succeeded. The fleet was real. The war was real. The hunger of 10,000 men was real. He had assembled reasons in a row, and stood among them like a man sheltering from wind. None of it touched her. She reached the altar and stopped. The priest raised his hands. The air above Aulis was utterly still. Not a breath moved. The sea lay flat and grey and enormous behind everything, indifferent. Artemis was present. Not visibly, not in a form that any soldier or priest or king could have pointed to. But she was there, as she had been there since the beginning of this, watching with the patience she had always carried, the patience that came from understanding how things moved and when and what they required. She had known it would come to this. She had known from the ridge above the dark valley, from the moment she turned her back on that view and walked into the trees. The resolution she had been carrying through the forest, those long nights, was here now, arrived at its appointed place. The blade was raised. Then something shifted, not a sound, not a light, something subtler. The quality of the air above the altar changed in a way no one could have named precisely, only felt. A density, a presence. Where Iphigenia had stood, there was a deer. It was pale, very still. It stood on the flat stone without moving, its dark eyes open, its breath visible in the cold air. Iphigenia was gone. The priests stood without moving. The soldiers stood without moving. Agamemnon stood without moving. The silence lasted a long time before anyone found the presence of mind to speak. High above the shore, above the flat grey sea, and the rows of waiting ships, and the cold altar, and the pale deer standing where a girl had stood, the air shifted. Something moved through it, very fast, very quiet, gone before it could be seen clearly. The sails of the fleet did not move yet. That would come. First there was only the absence where Iphigenia had been, and the deer standing in her place, and the long blank sky, and the sea beginning, very slowly, almost imperceptibly, to wake. The wind came before anyone expected it, not a gust, not a rush of cold air breaking suddenly across the shore, something gentler than that. A movement, the suggestion of movement. A single sail, somewhere in the middle of the fleet, lifted at its edge and settled again, as though testing whether this was real. The priests were still standing at the altar with their hands raised and nowhere to put them. Agamemnon had not moved. He was looking at the place on the stone where Iphigenia had been. The deer stood there quietly, its pale sides rising and falling. It did not seem afraid. It looked at nothing in particular, the way animals do when they have no reason to look at anything. The fire had been laid. The priests were present. All the machinery of the event was still assembled, but the centre of it had changed. After a long time, someone gave a quiet order. The soldiers began to move. Not quickly, with the careful, deliberate motion of men who are not certain what has just happened and have decided to behave as though they are. Above Aulis, above the shore and the ships and the stone altar and the pale deer, Artemis moved through the upper air. She carried Iphigenia the way the night carries certain things, without weight, without effort, without any trace of what had passed. The girl was still. Not unconscious, simply very calm, in the way that people sometimes become calm on the other side of an event they have passed through. The white garments moved faintly in the high cold wind. Below them the sea continued its slow waking. Grey to darker grey to the first suggestion of silver. Artemis did not look down for long. There was a place far to the east where she was taking the girl, a coast rougher than Aulis. Darker cliffs, darker water, a temple built on rock above a narrow shore, a place called Tauris, at the far limit of the world men of the fleet would have recognized. A place where Artemis kept her own counsel and was served by her own rites, away from the crowded south with its politics and its kings and its altars prepared in advance. Iphigenia would serve there. That was the resolution. Not cruelty and not mercy either precisely. Something more specific than either of those words. A life carried away from its intended end, set down somewhere else entirely. But that was later. Now there was only the cold air and the first grey light and the motion of moving through the sky above a sea that was beginning. Finally, to breathe. This is where the older part of the story lies. Not at Aulis, with its waiting ships and its difficult kings, but before all of that, long before. In a time when Artemis herself was not yet born. They say her mother was named Leto, a Titaness. Quiet in the way that some powerful things are quiet, not from weakness, but from a settled understanding that noise is rarely necessary. She was the daughter of older Titans, Coeus and Phoebe, and she carried in her the particular quality of those who were shaped before the world had finished deciding what it was. Leto became pregnant. The father was Zeus, which in the old stories is less a fact about love than a fact about power and consequence. What matters here is not the beginning of it, but what followed. Hera knew. Hera had always known, and her knowing was never a quiet thing. What she did was specific and deliberate. She sent her decree across the earth. No land, no shore, no island. Nothing that rested on the solid ground or was rooted to it could give Leto a place to deliver her children. The world obeyed. This is the part of the story that asks something of the imagination. Not the wrath of Hera, which is easy enough to picture, but the obedience of the earth. The mountains turning away, the shores drawing back, the island after island refusing to receive a woman who needed somewhere to stop. Leto walked, or moved through the world in whatever way a Titaness in that condition moves, slowly, heavily, carrying something enormous inside her. 2 children, both of them divine, both of them not yet existing in any form that could be seen or held. She went to many places. The tale does not name all of them. It only says she was refused everywhere. The ground beneath her feet was solid and would not open itself to her. The islands she approached turned their faces away. The sea was cold. The sky above it was pale and empty. She had been walking a long time. There is something in this part of the telling that settles slowly, like the stories that take a moment to find their weight. a woman moving through a world that has been instructed not to receive her. Every place she might have stopped already closed. The exhaustion of it is not only in her body, but in the repeated turning away, the gathering refusals. And yet she continued. She did not rage against it. That is part of what the story says, quietly, in the spaces between its events. Leto did not rail against the mountains or the shores or the islands that refused her. She moved on. She looked for the next place. There was always a next place to try, until there was one that answered differently. A small island, very small. It floated on the surface of the Aegean, not anchored to the seafloor the way proper land is anchored. The old name for it was Asteria, after the falling star that had been transformed into it. Leto's own sister, fleeing from Zeus, changed into a rocky mass drifting on the open water. The island the world would come to know as Delos, because it was not rooted. Because it rested on the sea rather than belonging to the solid earth beneath, Hera's decree had not reached it, or perhaps it had. And Delos had chosen differently regardless. That is another version, another telling. The island aware, in whatever way islands can be aware, and making a choice. What the stories agree on is this: Delos received her. The floating island did not turn away. It held still on the water and let her come to shore, and Leto, who had been walking through a world of closed doors, felt solid ground beneath her feet and stopped. She found the palm tree. There has always been a palm tree in this part of the story. She held onto it, both hands around its trunk, and the small island steadied beneath her, and the sea was cold around it on all sides, and the sky above was very wide. She had arrived. She would not be moved again. The birth was close now. Both of them. The two children she carried who would step into the world as fully formed divinity, who would be given domains and purposes and silver and gold, who would be worshipped for centuries in temples the size of mountains. But not yet. Now there was only the palm tree, the cold shore, the floating island that had said yes when every other place had said no. Leto held on. The sea moved steadily around Delos, dark and unhurried, the same sea it had always been. The story moves forward now, away from Delos, away from the cold Aegean and the palm tree and the waiting. It moves into a different world entirely. The forests of Arcadia. This is Artemis in her truest form. Not the goddess above an altar at Aulis, not the figure moving through the upper air with a girl held carefully in her arms. Here, in Arcadia, she is only herself, the hunter, the one who belongs to the places where paths stop and the trees begin their own arrangement, one that has nothing to do with any road laid by human hands. They say she came here often, that the mountains of Arcadia knew her the way mountains know weather, not by sight, but by the particular quality of what changes when she arrives. The air shifts slightly. The undergrowth goes still. The birds do not stop singing. They simply adjust the register. She moved through the pine forest in the grey hour before dawn. The ground underfoot was soft, pine needles and old soil, dark and damp from the night's cold. Her feet found the path without needing to look for it. She had walked this slope many times in many seasons, and her body remembered the particular places where the roots rose and the places where the ground gave slightly before firming again. The silver bow was across her back. Unstrung, this early in the morning, resting easy, it was lighter than anything silver had a right to be. She had carried it so long she no longer felt its weight separately from her own. Behind her, at intervals, her companions moved through the trees. Nymphs. There were many of them, though the tales rarely count them precisely. They were mountain nymphs and forest nymphs, and some who belonged to the cold streams that ran off the Arcadian slopes. They moved the way Artemis moved, without unnecessary sound, without stumbling, reading the ground the same way she did. They did not speak yet. Dawn hunts begin in silence. That was the understood thing. No word spoken until the light settled and the direction was chosen. Artemis paused at the edge of a stream. The water was very cold. She could hear it before she reached it, a low sound over small stones, consistent and unhurried. She crouched at the bank and pressed her palm flat to the surface. The cold moved up through her hand and into her wrist. She held it there for a moment. The stream ran from the higher slopes. Snowmelt, still carrying the temperature of elevation in it. The stones beneath her hand were smooth, pale, worn by water over an enormous span of time into their current quiet shapes. She cupped water and brought it to her face, cold, clean, the smell of stone and cold air and pine resin from somewhere upstream. She held the water there a moment before letting it run back down through her fingers. One of her companions arrived at the bank beside her. A nymph named Cyrene, broad-shouldered, dark-eyed, who hunted with a spear rather than a bow and seemed to prefer the direct weight of it. She crouched beside Artemis and drank from cupped hands without speaking. They remained like that for a moment. Two figures at a stream, the forest around them, the sky above the trees beginning to go from black to the deep blue that precedes dawn. The silence between them was comfortable. There was no need to fill it. This is the part of the story that is easy to overlook, not the great conflicts, not the divine interventions, not the moments when Artemis turned something irreversible with a single decision. Those moments exist, and the tale will return to them. But first, this. Two hunters at a cold stream, the forest still holding its night quiet. The water running over pale stones. They rose together and moved upstream, following the slope where the trees thinned and the rock began to show through the soil. Higher up, the ground hardened, frost in the shadowed places. The grass there was short and pale, silvered by the night's cold, and it crackled faintly underfoot when they passed through it. Artemis stopped. Her hand went back, and the companions behind her stopped too, reading the gesture without needing explanation. Every one of them had hunted beside her long enough to know the vocabulary of her stillness. She was looking at a ridgeline to the east. In the first suggestion of pale light, a shape was visible against the sky. A deer, standing with its head turned slightly, ears forward, testing the air. Artemis did not reach for the bough. She watched. The deer had not caught their scent. The wind was wrong for that, or right for it, depending on which direction you were counting from. The animal stood very still on the ridge, outlined in the first grey light, perfectly between the dark trees behind it and the paling sky ahead. There was something in this moment that the stories always circle back to, trying to say accurately. Artemis looking at the deer and not drawing the bow, the stillness of it. The refusal to move before the moment asked her to. She was a hunter. That is not in question. She had drawn the silver bow countless times, and the thing she aimed at had not stood after. Precision was her nature. She was not given to sentiment about the hunt. But she was also this, a goddess who stood in the cold at the boundary between forest and open slope and watched a deer on a ridge and let the moment exist without intervening in it. The deer turned its head, looked somewhere else, then stepped down from the ridge and disappeared into the dark trees on the far side. Artemis lowered her hand. The companions moved forward again. The frost crackled under their feet. The light was growing now, coming from the east in the slow, gradual way it always came over Arcadia, not sudden but accumulating. First the sky lightened, then the ridgeline, then the tops of the pines, then the slope itself, and the stream below, and the pale grass, and the faces of the women moving through it. Cyrene came up beside her. "No deer," she said. "Lo!" Not a complaint. Artemis looked ahead up the slope. The mountain above the tree line was dark rock and thin cloud. Higher up, where the paths ended entirely, the mountain became its own thing, indifferent to hunters, indifferent to gods shaped by older forces than either. She had gone to the top of it once, stood where the last plant gave up and the stone was bare and the wind came from every direction at the same time. There was nothing up there to hunt. She had not gone there to hunt. She had gone because there was something necessary about standing at the place where the mountain stopped being hospitable and became only itself. She felt that now, looking up. The hunt would find its moment. It always did. For now there was only the forest waking around her, the cold stream running below, the sky opening above the eastern ridge, going pale, going silver. 60 women moving through the trees behind her, their feet finding the ground the way her feet found it. The silver bow across her back, unstrung, easy, the wild world at the threshold of morning. Artemis walked on, the slope levelled as they crested the ridge. Below them, on the far side, the land opened into a wide valley, still in shadow. The trees there were older, taller, their lower branches lost in dark. The floor of the valley was soft with needles laid down over many years, pale brown, thick enough to silence footfall entirely. Artemis looked at it and felt the pull of the place. Old forest, undisturbed. The kind of ground that held the impressions of what had passed through it. She led them down. The companions spread naturally as the trees thickened around them. No order was given. They had learned her way of moving through dense forest, loose, each woman holding her own line through the trees, close enough to signal, far enough to cover ground. Cyrene moved off to the left, her spear carried low and horizontal, parallel to the ground. She moved well in close forest. Better than most, the valley floor received them without sound. Faint light fell through the canopy in pale columns, not sun yet. The light before sun, diffuse and sourceless, coming from the sky rather than from any point in it. The bark of the older trees was dark with moisture. Lichen on the north-facing sides, grey-green, soft-looking, roots lifting from the soil in long arching curves, smoothed at the top where deer and other things had walked the same lines for generations. Artemis crouched at one of those worn roots, pressed her fingers into the soil beside it. Damp, cold, and in the damp soil the clear print of a hoof, recent. The edges still sharp. Whatever had made it had passed this way not long before the cold deepened overnight. She studied it for a moment, then moved on. It was in moments like this one that the stories took a different turn, not the great moments. Not the drawn bow, the silver arrow moving through clean air, but this, a goddess crouched in dark forest, reading the ground the way her mother had taught her. Leto had not been a hunter. That was not her gift. But Leto had known how to read the land she moved across. She had learned it during the long wandering, during the months of crossing and recrossing the earth with nowhere to land, with every shore and hillside turning her away, with Hera's curse moving ahead of her like weather, closing doors before she could reach them. From that wandering, Leto had learned to read every surface for what it held and what it refused. Artemis had learned this from her, from watching, in the way young things watch their mothers. Not the formal passing of instruction, something quieter, the absorption of a way of attending to the world. But before the forests, before Arcadia and the silver bow and the 60 companions, there was the island. The tale holds that Delos was barely an island at all in those days, a small thing. Low and rocky, anchored to nothing, drifting in the sea between other islands that had more to recommend them. When Leto came to it, driven from everywhere else, it was not the kind of place a goddess chose willingly. She was exhausted. The wandering had done that. The weight of what she carried had done that. Zeus had given her children and then looked away, and Hera's fury had done the rest, sealing off every solid place against her. The mountains would not hold her. The river banks turned her on. Only Delos, with nothing to lose, with no standing and no certainty even of its own continued existence, had agreed to receive her. They say the island trembled when Leto stepped ashore. Not in fear, something else. A small, cold island of rock and thin grass, feeling for the first time the weight of something being given to it rather than taken away. Leto knelt on the rocky ground. The sea was close, the sound of it was close. She held the trunk of a palm tree, the one tree Delos had managed to grow in that thin salt soil, and she held it for 9 days and 9 nights while the other goddesses came to attend her. All except Hera, who held Eilethia, goddess of birth, on Olympus and would not release her. They say the other goddesses sent Iris at last across the sea with a necklace of gold 9 cubits long as an offering, and Eilethia came. And Leto was released from what she had been carrying. Artemis came first. That is the part worth holding on to. She came into the world on that small, uncertain island, on the rocky ground under the open sky, with the salt smell of the Aegean on the wind. The sea around Delos went still, the old stories say, in the moment of her birth. The water that had been restless held quiet, the way water holds quiet before it reflects something clearly. And then, and here the tale does something unusual, the newborn Artemis turned, not toward the warmth, not toward any ordinary comfort. She turned toward her mother. Leto was not done. Apollo had not yet come. There are births that are simple, and there are births that are not, and Leto's was not. 9 days of labour. 9 days without Eilethia. The effort of it had taken most of what Leto had left. She needed help. Artemis, new to existence, gave it. The stories do not dwell on the wonder of this. They state it plainly, the way plain things are stated. The newborn Artemis assisted in the birth of her twin. She stayed close. She steadied. She was present in the particular way that presence is required when someone is at the limit of what they can endure. Apollo came into the world on Delos with his sister's help. The island bloomed. The old accounts describe it, golden light spreading across the barren rock, flowers breaking through where no flowers had been. The palm tree throwing its shadow across a ground suddenly brighter than it had any right to be. Delos, which had been nothing, became for a long moment the most radiant place in the sea. Leto rested in that light. Her children were beside her. The wandering was over. What the stories do not record, because stories move toward the bright moments and away from the aftermath, was what came after the light settled. The ordinary quiet of it. Leto sleeping. 2 infants. An island barely large enough to hold them, the sea turning slowly around it in the early morning, the water catching the new sun. That image does not carry the weight of myth. It does not seem like the origin of anything. 2 children on a small island, one of them already sleeping, one of them already watching the water, but the goddess crouching now in the dark forest of Arcadia, her fingers in cold, damp soil, reading the track of something that had passed in the night she had begun there, on that island, in that quiet aftermath. Cyrene moved back through the trees and came to stand nearby. She looked at the track in the soil without speaking. Artemis rose. The valley was lighter now. The columns between the trees had widened and warmed slightly. Higher up, on the south-facing slopes above the valley, the first true light of morning was touching the pale grass, turning it from silver to gold. The hunt would find what it was looking for. That had never been in question. Artemis moved deeper into the old forest. The pine needles made no sound under her feet. That was the forest's particular gift to those who moved through it. Not silence exactly, but the muffling of small things, the creak of a branch far above, the distant, unhurried drip of water from bark. Between those sounds, a softness that pressed against the ears like cloth. Artemis moved through it without pausing. The companions were spread wide now, each woman holding her line through the older part of the forest where the trees grew closer and the roots rose higher from the soil. Cyrene had taken the left edge of the formation, working the denser ground where the undergrowth pressed between the trunks. The others kept their distances. No one called out. There was no need. Each of them had learned, over long years in forests like this one, how far a voice carries in still air and what it costs when it does. The track from the clearing had continued north. Artemis had read that much. 2 impressions in the soft ground before the trees thickened again. A deer moving without hurry, not yet alarmed, going somewhere familiar. Ahead, the trees opened slightly, a gap between 2 great trunks, their roots interlocking below the soil. Artemis slowed. She stopped, crouched again, left hand on the earth. The soil here was different, drier despite the morning. She pressed 2 fingers into it and felt the give, shallow. The rock was close beneath. This was old ground, worn down over a long time by water and cold and the weight of trees above it. A different track here, smaller. Older than the deer. She looked at it for a long moment. Fox, perhaps, or something smaller still. It did not matter. She released it and rose. These were the things Leto had taught her, not deliberately, not as instruction. During the long wandering, all those months moving from shore to shore, from mountain to mountain, each place closing its doors, Leto had not had the luxury of stillness. She had learned to read the world from motion, to assess ground while walking across it, to know from the texture of mud beneath a foot whether the bank would hold or give, to sense from the angle of shadows which way the hills rose. She had carried all of this forward with her because she had no choice, and her daughter had been carried inside her through all of it. Some knowledge does not require learning. It arrives already present, the way warmth arrives in stone that has spent a long time in sun. Artemis had crouched over ground her whole life. Bow aside, arrows aside. Just fingers in the earth, and the quiet process of understanding what the earth was saying. But there had been another thing. For the earth, before the forests. There had been Olympus. She had been very young then. The world had not yet arranged itself fully in her understanding. She knew what she was, the way young things sometimes know, not through experience, but through a clarity that precedes experience. The way a bird knows the direction of warm air without having flown before, she had found Zeus on his throne in the long hall. The light there was the particular light of high places, white and clear and slightly cold, the way all high places are slightly cold even in warmth. She had climbed onto his knee. That is what the old stories hold, and it rings true. Not timid, not requesting an audience. Simply present, the way children are present when they want something and see no reason to approach it indirectly. Zeus had looked down at her. The tale says he laughed. Probably he did. There is a quality to certainty in a very young creature that tends to produce that response. She told him what she wanted. No husband, no house. No life of measured domesticity behind stone walls with oil lamps and looms. Those things were not for her. She had been born on open ground under open sky, and she understood from that first moment that walls were not her element. What she wanted was this, the mountains, the forests, the wild places that had no owners and required no tending, the places that existed before men arrived with their measurements and their boundaries and their careful divisions of the land. She wanted a silver bow. Arrows made for distance. She wanted them made by the Cyclopes themselves, those enormous patient craftsmen in their deep forges. And she wanted them made to her measure, not the measure of any god or hero who had come before. She wanted companions. 60 of them, nymphs of the forests and the water meadows, women who would choose, as she was choosing, a life outside the ordinary arrangements. 60 who would move through the wilderness as she moved, who would know the ground the way she knew it. And she wanted something harder to name, permanence. A freedom that could not be revoked by marriage or circumstance, or the decisions of others. She had seen enough, even then, of how divine arrangements were made. She had no interest in being part of one she had not chosen. Zeus gave her everything she asked for. The old storytellers note this with a kind of fond approval, a father indulging a daughter. But that framing is too simple. There was recognition in it. Zeus understood what his daughter was asking for and understood why. He had been present at some remove for the wandering. He had not stopped Hera, but he had known. He had given Leto children and looked away. And the consequence of that looking away had been 9 days of labour on a cold island with no midwife and no shelter. What Artemis asked for on his knee was not indulgence. It was a renegotiation. A quiet, very clear statement of what she was and what she required, made to the only one with the authority to confirm it. He confirmed it. The silver bow came from the Cyclopes, as she had asked. They had made it carefully. The old descriptions say it matched her. Balanced in a particular way, not heavy, not ornamental, made for use. The companions came from the forests and the cold streams of Arcadia and from the mountain meadows of the north, each one chosen. Each one, in her own way, arriving with the same recognition Artemis had brought to Zeus's throne, a knowledge of what she was that did not require explanation. The mountains became hers, the forests became hers. Not in the way a king owns territory, not through conquest or decree. She belonged to them the way the cold belongs to high places. The association was so complete it had no edges. The companions moved between the trees below her. Cyrene's spear was visible through a gap in the trunks, carried at that low horizontal angle she used in close ground. 2 others were visible. Further right, dark shapes against the lighter darkness of the forest interior. The valley floor had continued to lighten, slowly. Not from any single source. The sky above the canopy was greyer now. Less like night. The shapes of things were resolving. The lichen on the north-facing bark was visible without effort. The arched roots cast low shadows across the pale pine needles. Higher up, above the forest canopy, above the valley walls, the south-facing slopes were gold now, not the silver they had been an hour before. True morning light moving down toward the valley. It had not reached the forest floor yet. Artemis looked up through the canopy. A gap in the branches showed a strip of sky. Pale, clear. The blue that precedes the blue of day. One star still visible at the edge of it, steady and low. The last one to remain as the sky filled with light. She held it for a moment. Then she turned back to the forest. The deer track continued north. Steady, unhurried. The forest was listening, in the particular way old trees listen when something moves among them that belongs there. She followed. The sound reached her before anything else, not the deer. The deer was still somewhere ahead, moving north through pine shadow, unhurried, unbothered. What Artemis heard was different. It came from the south, from the direction of the river. A low sound, almost nothing. The kind of sound moving water makes when it shifts direction in the night, when something changes the shape of the current from below. She stopped. The companions felt it before she gestured. Cyrene's spear came up a degree. The 2 shapes further right went still. The forest adjusted around them, everyone finding the particular stillness that the old trees preferred. Artemis listened. The sound was not threatening. It had no sharp edge to it, but it was purposeful. That was the quality that mattered. Moving water does not have purpose. What she was hearing did. She knew rivers the way she knew most things in the wild world. She had waded their shallows since before the silver bow had come to her hands. She had read their moods in the way she read the earth. Rivers had personalities. They had tendencies. She had no quarrel with any of the river gods of this country, but she also knew that knowing something and being known by something were different arrangements entirely. Alpheus moved the way his river moved. That was the first new thing she understood, standing still in the pre-dawn forest. A river does not hurry, it does not tire. It finds its way around obstacles not by force but by patience, by the slow accumulation of small pressures. It does not announce itself. It simply arrives, and continues arriving, and the stone does not wear the water down, but the other way around. She had felt his attention before. Not here. Further south, near the coast where his river ran wide and shallow before it met the sea. She had passed through that territory on a different hunt 3 seasons back, and there had been something in the way the current moved that she recognized as intent rather than accident. She had not paused then, she had continued, and the hunt had concluded, and the matter had seemed finished. It was not finished. Artemis turned to look at Cyrene. A single gesture, slow and deliberate. Cyrene understood it. She passed it sideways through the formation without sound, a ripple of stillness moving outward through the trees. The companions gathered, not close. They came in from their positions and held, spread but near, within sight of one another in the grey pre-dawn forest, 12 faces visible, catching the first faint light through the canopy. Artemis crouched, not to read the earth this time. She pressed her fingers into the soft ground, into the pale pine needles and the dark soil beneath, and what she was reading was not animal track, but the ground's own memory of moisture. Whether the river had been here, whether the river was here now, moving through soil that looked dry but held something beneath, the soil was damp. Not from morning, from below. She stood. What she did next was not something the old stories explain fully. They describe only the result, but the method had a logic that anyone who understood forests would recognize. A river god who searches for a particular figure among a group of figures needs the figures to be distinguishable. He needs to know which one he is looking for. There was a hollow nearby. She had noted it earlier, half her attention on the deer track, half on the shape of the ground around her. A low depression in the forest floor where water collected in wetter seasons, where the soil stayed soft and pale even in dry weather, where clay lay close to the surface. She went to it. The clay was pale, almost white in this light. She worked a small amount free with her fingers. It was cold, dense, the kind of clay that holds its shape. She looked back at Cyrene, then at the others. No one spoke. Understanding moved through the group the way cold air moves through a forest in the hour before dawn, quiet, without announcement, simply present and then undeniable. One by one they came to the hollow. One by one they crouched and gathered the pale clay in their fingers and smoothed it across their faces. Forehead, cheekbones, the bridge of the nose, the curve of the jaw. The clay was cool against the skin. It had a smell to it. Stone and still water, and something older than either. Artemis did the same. She covered her face carefully, not hiding. That was not the right word for it. The word was closer to erasing, making the distinction impossible. A river that could not tell one face from another, could not choose between them, could not distinguish the one it sought from the 11 who surrounded her. They stood among the trees, white-faced in the pre-dawn light, still as the trees themselves. The forest floor was quiet. The pine needles made no sound underfoot because no one was moving. The roots rose from the soil like old arguments, and the lichen on the north bark was visible now in the growing grey light, and above the canopy the strip of sky had shifted from pale to something approaching blue. The sound from the river moved closer, then stopped. It remained stopped for a long time. The last star was still visible through the gap in the canopy, low and steady, holding its position while the sky filled slowly around it with light. It would fade soon. It always did. But for now it remained, small and clear, indifferent to the shapes standing motionless in the forest below. Then the sound from the river shifted. changed direction, moved away. Slowly, the way a river changes course, not urgently, not in retreat, simply finding a different path, the way water does when a path is no longer available to it. The forest let out a breath. Cyrene lowered her spear back to the horizontal. The two shapes on the right loosened. Small adjustments moved through the formation, shoulders settling. Weight redistributing. Artemis did not move immediately. She remained still for another long moment, listening to the absence of sound where the sound had been, making certain of it. The forest did not reward assumptions, only attention. Then she turned toward the shallow pool at the base of a grey rock nearby. Small, still. Cold enough that the surface held the reflection of the sky without distortion, she crouched at its edge and pressed both hands into the water. The clay came away slowly. The water was very cold. It carried the pale colour off her fingers, diluting it, letting it disperse. She sat back on her heels and looked at the pool for a moment. The pale water stilled again. The reflected sky was clear. The deer track was still there, continuing north through the pines, steady and unhurried. The forest was quiet in the way it was quiet when nothing was coming. She rose, dried her hands against the side of her leg, looked north toward where the track continued through the old trees. Then she followed it. The deer had passed this way sometime in the last hour. The track showed it. Clean edges, no moisture gathering at the rim. Moving north with the particular steadiness of an animal that had not been disturbed, Artemis followed it. The pine forest thinned slightly as the ground rose. The trees here were older, their trunks wider, the canopy above them less dense, so that the morning light came through in pale columns that touched the needle-covered floor and moved slightly as the branches moved. The smell was of pine resin and cold stone, and the particular damp that comes when night releases its hold on the earth and the air begins to warm. Behind her, the 12 moved without sound. Cyrene was close. The others spread back in the loose line they held when the hunt was active. No one spoke. The hunt continued. That was the truth of it. Whatever Alpheus had been, whatever had passed through the ground to the south, it had passed. The deer was ahead. The morning was arriving. The forest remained the forest, but something had shifted. Artemis knew it the way she knew weather, not by thinking about it, by the changed quality of the air around it. She kept walking. And as she walked, she let the morning carry a memory that had stayed low in her for years, not rising, not chosen, simply there now, in the particular quiet of a forest resumed after threat. Callisto had run like this, not from something outside the band, from something that had already happened, something that had found her in the middle of ordinary days and left its mark before anyone knew to guard against it. She had been one of the 12, one of the original band. Her bow was good, her feet on stone were quiet. She had taken the oath that all of them took, the same words, the same morning, standing in a cold stream in Arcadia with the current moving across their feet. The oath was not complicated. It was not long. It asked only what it asked. And Callisto had spoken it clearly, the way the others had. That was the part that the old stories do not linger on. Not the betrayal itself, which was not Callisto's doing, not the discovery, which was unavoidable, but the space between the oath and the morning when everything was visible, and what had been invisible was suddenly not. Artemis slowed slightly. The deer track curved to the left around the base of a large stone. She followed the curve. Zeus had done it. She had understood this clearly even then. He had taken Callisto's face and given it her own, or something so close to her own that the difference was only visible from the inside, from where Callisto stood, from the confusion in her eyes before she understood what was happening, and then the confusion of a different kind after. There was no revenge to be taken on Zeus for this. She had known that too. Some injuries are too large and too old for the architecture of revenge to reach. But Callisto had come back to the pool. That was the thing. They bathed in a cold pool in the Arcadian hills, flat stone on 3 sides. The water running in from a narrow channel between the rocks, clear enough to see the bottom. They bathed there after long hunts, after days when the dust of running had settled into the skin, and Callisto had come back. She had stood at the edge of the pool and removed her robe the way she always had, without hurry, without evasion, as if she had decided that what had happened to her should not also cost her this. The pool, the cold water, her place among them, but the body carries what the mind cannot always hide. And in that moment, standing at the stone edge of the pool in the clear morning, the shape of what had happened to her was simply present, undeniable. The way the soil beneath the pines was damp when nothing above ground showed rain, Artemis had looked. She had understood. The understanding was not slow. She had turned away from the pool and walked to the flat stone on the far side and sat down on it. She could hear the water. She could hear the others going quiet. She had not been angry at Callisto. That was the weight of it, the thing the stories often get wrong, making her cold, making her swift and certain. But she had not been angry. What she had felt was something older and harder to name. A grief that had no object it could reach, an injury with no wound she could close. Callisto could not stay. Not because of the oath broken, though the oath had been broken. Not because of what Zeus had done, though that was at the center of it, but because the band held its shape by a particular kind of trust. Not the trust of liking, not the warmth of long companionship, but a trust more functional than that, the kind that lets you move through dark forest at speed, letting the others behind you fall where you cannot see them, and know without looking that they are there. That trust required the oath to remain intact, not as a rule, as a fact of how the 12 moved together. She had told Callisto to go, not harshly, not with ceremony. She had sat on the flat stone and said it, and her voice had been level, and Callisto had not argued, because Callisto had known what Artemis knew, that there was no path back across the pool's edge to where she had been standing before the morning she came back. Callisto had gathered her robe, had looked at Artemis once. Artemis had looked back. Then Callisto had walked north into the trees. The deer track turned slightly east. Artemis followed it. The morning had fully arrived now. The columns of light through the pines were brighter. The canopy moved in a low breath of wind that smelled of the higher slopes, of limestone and juniper. She did not know, that day at the pool, what would happen to Callisto after. The stories that came later, Hera's fury, the transformation into bear, the stars, those came after. What she had known in the moment was only the flat stone under her legs, and the cold air off the water, and the particular heaviness of a decision that could not be unmade. That was the turning. Not the loud kind, the kind that happens in a single held breath. The deer had paused here. She could see it in the track. A slight deepening of the rear print, an animal standing still, lifting its head. Then the track continued east, steady again. Artemis lifted her own head. The forest was open ahead, old pines giving way to a slope of pale stone and thin grass. The deer would be visible on that slope. It would stand against the open sky. She moved forward. Cyrene came up beside her without being called. They walked in step for a moment, the old pine needles quiet underfoot, the morning clear around them. The sky above the slope was blue and still. The deer would be there. The deer was there. It stood on the pale slope, exactly where the track had promised it would be. A young stag, not yet fully grown, his antlers still soft with the season's new growth. He had his head up. He was looking north, away from them, unaware. Cyrene slowed without being told. The others behind them slowed as well. Artemis could feel the line compress. the 12 drawing together the way they always did at this moment. No signal, no word. Just the particular stillness that moved through them when the prey was in sight and everything else fell away. The slope was open and bright. The morning had reached it fully now. The pale stone caught the light and held it. The stag's coat was red-brown against all that brightness, vivid and clear. Artemis did not reach for her bow. She stood at the tree line and watched him. The silver bow was across her shoulder. Her hand did not move toward it. She simply looked. There was a particular quality to an animal that did not yet know it was being watched. The stag moved his head slowly north, then east. His ears turned. He lowered his nose briefly to the thin grass and then raised it again. All of this was ordinary. All of it was what animals did when the world around them was undisturbed. Cyrene glanced at her. Artemis did not return the glance. The stag took 2 steps east along the slope and stopped. His weight settled. He lowered his head to the grass. The morning was very clear, very still. Behind her the pines were quiet. The last of the morning damp was lifting off the needle floor. The resin smell was stronger now, warmer than it had been an hour ago, the cold of the night finally releasing from the bark. She thought of Orion, not deliberately. The thought arrived the way thoughts arrive when the mind is not occupied with urgency, quietly, through the side. Orion had been the only one she had ever hunted beside who moved the way she moved. Not in imitation, not because he had learned it from her, but because his body had the same knowledge hers did, the knowledge of stillness. The knowledge of when to stop and let the world ahead of you settle before you continued. He was large. That was the first thing people noted about him, tall enough that the stories always mentioned it. But his size had never made him loud. He moved through forest the way water moves through stone, without announcement. Finding the path that was already there, rather than making a new one, they had hunted the ranges above the sea together. She remembered the smell of salt and pine mixed together, the way the air changed when the trees gave way to cliff and open water. The mountains of the coast, grey and steep, the sea below them flat and pale in the early light. He had not spoken much. That was the thing she had valued first. Most beings who came into her presence felt the need to fill the silence. Orion had not. He had simply walked beside her through the long mornings, his own bow across his shoulder. His eyes on the same ground hers were reading. They had stood on cliff edges together watching the sea below lighten. They had tracked game through high passes where the wind came from the north and smelled of a coldness that had no name in any language. They had sat on flat stones at the end of long days while the light left the sky, not speaking, the silence between them steady and without weight. She had not loved him the way the stories say. The stories always want a particular shape for it. They want longing. Want the gods brought low by feeling. But what she had carried for Orion was different. More like the recognition you feel when you find a second path through country you thought had only one. Not surprise. Not want. Only the steady acknowledgement that something rare was present. The stag lifted his head again. He had heard something at the far end of the slope. A bird moving in the scrub above him. He watched it. Then he settled again. Cyrene was still at her side. She had not moved. Her patience was complete. Of all the 12, she was the steadiest. She had been with Artemis longer than any of the others, long enough that she no longer needed to understand why a decision was being made. She only needed to know that one had been made. Artemis let the thought of Orion finish itself. He was not here. He had not been here for a long time. The mountains above the sea where they had walked together were still there. The cliff edges were still there. The flat stones, the pale light over still water. All of it remained. Only the figure beside her on those mornings was gone. That was the shape of it, not a wound, a subtraction. a place in the landscape that had once held something and now held only the landscape. She reached for her bow. The motion was unhurried. She lifted the silver bow from her shoulder and drew an arrow from the quiver at her back and set it. Her fingers knew the string. They had always known it. The bow had been her first gift, asked for on Zeus's knee when she was still a child who already understood what she would need. The silver was smooth and cool under her palm. The string under her fingers was familiar as breath. The stag was still feeding. His head was down. Artemis drew. The bow bent in its clean arc. Her arm was steady. Her eye moved down the arrow to the point where it would meet the air. The slope was bright. The stag was motionless. The morning held itself in a stillness that felt less like quiet and more like a single note sustained. She released. The arrow crossed the slope without sound. The stag fell without drama. One step, and then he was down on the pale stone, the thin grass around him catching the last of the arrow's displacement. The line behind her began to move. The 12 came forward out of the tree line, spreading across the slope. Their feet found the pale stone. The sound of them came back to the world, quiet voices. The soft percussion of movement over open ground. Cyrene walked ahead to the stag. She knelt beside it. Her hands were practiced. She worked without being watched. Artemis lowered the bow. She looked out past the slope to where the land continued eastward, more hills. A long valley between them, pale with morning, and beyond that, just visible, a line of something darker that might be water or might be the shadow of higher ground. The hunt was done for this morning. She slung the bow back across her shoulder. The arrow was already gone from her hand. The string settled back to rest against the silver frame. The stag's track had led here. It had curved north, then east, through the pines and onto the open slope. Every mark in the ground had meant something. Every pause in the print had been a piece of information she had read without slowing. That was the work, not the arrow, not the moment of release. The long, unhurried reading of what the ground said. The willingness to follow a track through dark pine without knowing exactly where it led, trusting that the knowledge in her feet and hands and eyes would be enough. It had always been enough. She walked to where Cyrene was working. Stood beside her for a moment. The sky above the valley was a deep, clean blue. A hawk crossed it, moving west, unhurried. She watched it go. The hawk was gone behind the hills before Artemis turned away. Cyrene had finished. She rose from beside the stag and moved back toward the tree line where the others were already gathering, speaking among themselves in low voices. The 12 settled into their rest without ceremony. Some sat on flat stones. One filled a water skin from a clay vessel she carried on her back. The sounds of the group were quiet and domestic and ordinary. Artemis did not join them immediately. She stood near the center of the slope where the pale stone was warm now from the risen sun. The valley below held its pale light. The darker line she had seen to the east was water, she could tell that now, a river or the long edge of a lake. It caught the light in the way still water does, flat and silver and without movement. The sight of it brought Thebes into her mind. She did not resist the memory. There was no use in that. Memories came when they chose to, and this one had been close all morning. Hovering at the back of things, the way a cold front hovers before it fully arrives, Thebes had been a city of white stone and noise. She had not gone there often. Cities were not her territories. But she had gone once with purpose, and the memory of it did not soften with distance. Her mother's name had been spoken in Thebes as a lesser thing. That was the beginning of it. Niobe, queen of that bright and crowded city, had stood in her own temple courts and told her people that Leto deserved no worship. That Leto deserved no altars, no offerings, no prayers. She had 14 children, Niobe said. 7 sons and 7 daughters, all of them living, all of them strong, and Leto had only 2. 2 was not enough to be a goddess worth honouring, Niobe had decided. Artemis had been in the high forests of Arcadia when the word reached her. She did not receive it as news exactly. She received it the way the body receives cold water. All at once, everywhere. She had not gone to Apollo first. She had not consulted. There was nothing to consult about. Their mother's name had been spoken in contempt before people who were supposed to speak it with reverence. The offerings had been turned away, the altar flowers scattered. Niobe had done all of this in full sunlight, in full voice, and she had done it knowing what she was doing. Artemis had left Arcadia before the morning was finished. She did not remember the road to Thebes clearly. She remembered the way the forest thinned as the land changed. The trees grew smaller and further apart. The ground became harder under her feet. The smell of resin faded and was replaced by something drier, more open. The smell of a land that spent more of its year in full sun. She remembered the city walls below her, white in the afternoon light. Apollo was already there, or arrived shortly after. They did not speak when they met. That was the way of it between them sometimes. The older business between twins, the kind of communication that did not require words. He had his bow. She had hers. They both understood what the morning would require. What came after was not done in anger. That is the part the stories often miss. They want rage, want the gods blazing and terrible, striking down the innocent in furious punishment. But it was not that, or it was not only that. It was something quieter, colder. The way a winter comes in, not through one storm, but through the slow withdrawal of warmth day by day, until the ground is iron and the light is thin and sharp. She had moved through the lower city without being seen, her feet on the stone roads. The smell of smoke and bread and animals, and the particular dense smell of many people living close together. It had been midday. The daughters of Niobe were in the open ground below the high palace, 7 of them. They were not yet afraid. They did not yet know what had been decided. She did not think of them as guilty. That was not the word that applied to them. But they were woven into what their mother had done. The boast had named them. Niobe had held them up as the proof of her superiority. She had placed them into the argument. And in the old law, which was older than Artemis and older than Olympus, that kind of placing had consequences. Artemis had reached for the silver bow. The sun had been high, and the light on the stone streets had been very bright. She remembered the shadows the buildings cast, short and dense, the way shadows are when the sun is directly above. She remembered the sound of the city, which was constant and various, the way city sounds always were. She had drawn her first arrow. The work had been exact, unhurried. One arrow, and then another, and the space between them was not long. She did not stop to look. She had learned long ago that looking changed nothing. An arrow released was already finished. It had already arrived at its destination. The looking was only for the person doing it, and she did not need that. What she carried back with her from Thebes was not guilt. She knew the shape of guilt, and this was not it. The law had been satisfied. Her mother's name had been defended. Those were real things. They had weight and consequence and meaning. But the silence of the lower city as she left, the particular quality of that silence, she carried that. It was different from the silence of forest or mountain. Those silences were full. They held the sounds of water and wind and the small movements of living things. The silence she had left in Thebes was empty in a different way. It was the silence of something taken out of a room. Not the room itself, not the walls or the floor or the ceiling. Only the thing that had been living inside it. She had not returned to Thebes after that morning. She did not know if the altars had been rebuilt. She did not know if Niobe had finally turned back to the proper reverence. Those things were not her to measure. She had done what the law required. What happened in the city afterward was the city's own. The valley below held its silver line of water. Cyrene appeared at her shoulder, not close enough to crowd, far enough to give room, which was Cyrene's understanding, always, of what Artemis needed in any given moment. They stood together looking east for a time. The memory of Thebes settled back into its place. It did not disappear. It never disappeared. It only found its level, the way water finds its level, and then it was still. The pale stone under her feet was warm. The pine smell behind her was strong. The 12 were ready. She could hear them gathering at the tree line, the soft sounds of preparation, the small adjustments people make before they move. Artemis turned from the valley. She walked back toward the trees. The trees received her the way they always did, without ceremony. The branches did not part dramatically. The shadows did not shift to mark her passage. She simply moved from the open stone into the pine dark, and the forest closed around her the way a hand closes around something familiar. The 12 were ready. They had learned not to ask questions when she came back from the edge of the slope. They read the set of her shoulders, the angle of her head, and they understood. Some things were carried and not shared. That was the way of it in this band. Cyrene fell into step 2 paces behind her left shoulder. The others followed in the loose, easy order they had settled into over years of moving together through wild country. The ground under the pines was soft with old needles. The smell was strong here. Resin and shade, and the faint mineral cold of stone underneath. The morning light did not reach the forest floor directly. It fell in long, pale columns where the canopy thinned, and everywhere else it was the even grey-green quiet of deep tree shadow. They moved north. Artemis did not think about where they were going. Exactly. She knew the land well enough that her feet made the decisions and her mind could rest. That was one of the things the wilderness gave her that no other place could. The relief of not having to decide consciously. The body simply moved and the land received it. The forest went on for a long time. Then the trees began to thin again. Not all at once. A few more columns of light. A bit more sky showing above. The ground firmed under them, and the needle bed gave way to pale grass and flat limestone showing through. They came out onto a high ridge. The sky was wide above them. The wind came from the west, cooler than the morning below had been. To the north, the land rolled away in long folds of grey and green, and above it all, the moon hung low over the horizon. Pale and full, almost transparent in the day sky, the way the moon sometimes looks when the sun has not yet fully claimed the light for its own. Artemis looked at it for a moment. There are things the stories say about Artemis and the moon. And some of them are true, and some of them are the kind of truth that comes from watching at a distance and explaining what you see in the nearest available language. The moon was not hers, the way the forest was hers. The forest was territory. The moon was something else. They called her one of 3, Selene above, riding her silver chariot across the night sky, full and brilliant and present. Hecate below, moving through the dark places, the crossroads and the deep shadows, holding her torches. And Artemis between, neither the pure light of the full wheel nor the hidden fire of the underworld dark, but the shifting middle, the crescent pulling through its changes. The moon as it moved rather than as it rested. The 3 faces, they called it. The 3 forms of a single turning. Mortal priests had made much of this. They had built temples and arranged rituals around the idea of the triad. They had drawn correspondences between the phases and the goddesses, the full moon for Selene's radiance, the waning dark for Hecate's knowledge, the crescent and the hunt for Artemis. She did not disagree with this, but she understood it differently than they did. Selene was her own being entirely, a titaness of great age, older than the Olympians. Her chariot was real, her passage across the sky its own sovereign thing. Hecate was older still in some respects, her power rooted in the original arrangement of the cosmos before the Olympians remade the order of things. They were not aspects of Artemis. They were themselves, fully and separately themselves. But they were connected. That much was true. Not by blood exactly, by what they governed and where they moved. Selene moved through the open sky above all things. Hecate moved through the deep places beneath. And Artemis moved through the wild land between, the forests and mountains and unmarked ground where nothing had been built and nothing had been named, and the old rules still applied without revision. Between the three of them, something was covered that no single goddess could have covered alone. The night, in all its vertical depth, from the stars above to the roots below, with the living, breathing, hunting world in the middle. The moon sat above the ridgeline, pale and round and already beginning its slow decline toward the western hills. Cyrene came to stand beside her. Neither of them spoke. Cyrene was looking at the same horizon, and perhaps she saw the same thing, or perhaps she saw something different. That was the nature of standing beside another person and looking outward. You could never be certain you were seeing the same world. After a time, Artemis turned from the ridge. The 12 had settled briefly, some crouching, some standing, all of them easy in the way people are easy when they are used to waiting and moving in equal measure. There was no restlessness among them. That had been one of the conditions. In the old days, when she had gone to her father and asked for her companions, she had asked for those who would not change their minds, who would not decide one morning that the city was more interesting than the mountain. The 60 nymphs she had asked for then had winnowed over the long years of the world into something smaller and more constant. These 12. The silver bow was still on her back. She had not drawn it since Thebes, which had been a long time ago. The bow had its own presence. She was always aware of it, the way one is aware of something that is part of how one moves through the world, not separate from the body, but not entirely the body either. The wind shifted. It came from the north now, and with it the smell of water somewhere below, a different water than the silver line in the valley behind them. This was moving water, she could tell by the smell, which was cooler and carried something green. She looked at Cyrene. Cyrene nodded without being asked. They moved off the ridge and down the northern slope, into the lower green where the sound of the river reached them before they could see it. A low, steady voice in the rock. The sound of water that had been moving through the same channel for longer than any mortal memory held. The trees here were different, broader leafed, more light between them, moss on the north sides of the stones. The ground was damp and gave slightly underfoot, and the smell of it was the dark, living smell of soil that never fully dried. The river appeared between 2 grey limestone shelves, narrow and fast-moving green-black in the shadow of the trees that arched over it. Artemis stopped at the bank. The water moved past her boots without hesitating. It had no interest in her name or her history or what she carried from Thebes. It simply moved the way water moves, with complete attention to what it was doing and nothing left over for anything else. She stood there until the ridge behind her was fully out of sight. The 12 settled along the bank. The sound of the river filled the space between the trees. Above the canopy, just visible through a gap in the leaves, the last pale disk of the daytime moon was descending toward the hills. Artemis watched it go. The moon finished its descent behind the western hills. Light remained. It always did. The sky above the canopy shifted from pale to a deeper, clearer blue, and the shadows between the broad-leafed trees settled into their midday positions, short and direct. Artemis crouched at the bank. The water was cold. She held her hand in the current until the cold reached the bone, then drew her hand back and dried it against her tunic. The river had left a smell on her palm, stone and green and something older beneath both. She did not need to drink. She drank anyway. Cyrene had moved a short distance upstream to where the bank widened and a flat stone extended over the water. She sat there without speaking. The others had arranged themselves along the bank in the loose, instinctive way they always arranged themselves, some watching the far side, some watching nothing in particular. All of them present without performing presence. The river moved. Between the limestone shelves the current quickened, finding channels in the rock, splitting and rejoining. Upstream a wider pool opened behind a low shelf where the water slowed. Light reached it through a gap in the canopy above. The surface held that light without giving it back, green and still in contrast to the running water below. Artemis saw the pool before she moved toward it. She had seen a pool like this before, many times. This one was unremarkable in itself. Rocks along the near bank, ferns pressing close to the water. The smell of damp stone and something cool and sweet, the way clean water smells in a deep shaded place that the afternoon does not reach. She moved upstream. The 12 noticed without watching. That was a skill that came with long years. To track without appearing to. She set the silver bow on a flat stone at the bank's edge. The water was deeper than it looked. It always was in pools like this. The surface gave the impression of shallowness, but the floor was invisible, lost in green shadow. She waded in slowly. The cold came up through her boots and then above them. She kept going. The 12 stayed on the bank. This was one of the old rules. Not a spoken one. It had never needed to be spoken. There were moments that belonged to her, and these were among them. The companions understood it. Had always understood it. Water and stillness were hers alone. The hunt they shared. This they did not. She stood waist deep in the center of the pool. Above her the canopy moved in the wind, and light shifted across the water. It moved in slow shapes, pale and irregular, the way light moves when leaves shift between it and the ground. Then something changed in the air. It was not a sound at first, more like the quality of the silence around the pool. She had stood in enough silences to know when one had been disrupted from the outside rather than from within. The forest itself understood it. A single bird fell quiet in the oak above the far bank. The small sounds along the water's edge paused. Footsteps, heavy, moving without awareness of what they were moving toward, a mortal. She could tell by the weight of the step in the wet ground, moving quickly, careless of the branches. Someone accustomed to moving through forests, or someone who believed he was. He came through the tree line on the far bank. He stopped when he saw her. His name was Actaeon. She knew him without knowing how she knew him, the way certain knowledge arrives complete. He was a hunter. She could see that in how he stood, in the bow on his back, in the easy posture of someone who had spent long years in terrain like this. He was not a bad man. That was the thing the old tale never made easy. He had not come here to intrude. He had simply come, without knowing, following water through the trees the way any experienced hunter would, but knowing had never been the condition. This was hers, this pool, this silence. This was the ground on which she stood, and where no other eyes came. She looked at him across the water. He did not look away fast enough. What moved through her was not rage. Rage was too hot a word for it. It was something colder and more settled, the recognition of a thing that had already been decided the moment he stepped through the trees, not by her emotion, but by the law she lived in. The law she was. The wild places had edges. The edges had consequences. This had been true before she was born, and would be true long after. She raised her hand from the water. What passed from her hand into the air between them was not light or fire or anything visible. It was a change, simple and complete. The kind that, once begun, does not stop. Actaeon took one step back. Then he was not Actaeon any longer, or not entirely. The shift moved through him from the outside in. the way cold moves through cloth. His hands, his face, his shoulders broadening and dropping and changing shape. He ran. She heard him go through the trees on the far bank, crashing through the undergrowth, fast at first. Then the sound changed, became the sound of a different creature moving. Something lighter, quicker. Something that did not understand what had happened to it. Then she heard the hounds. They were his own. That was the part that the old tale carried, the detail that gave it its particular weight. They had followed him this far into the forest, and when they picked up his scent, they did not recognize it as his. They recognized only what the scent told them. Something to chase. She stood still in the pool. The sounds moved away through the trees, and then grew distant, and then ended. She did not feel satisfaction. She did not feel regret. Both of those belonged to choices freely made. This had not been a choice exactly. It had been the world following its own terms. He had come to a place he should not have come to, and the place had responded in the only way it knew. The pool settled around her. The bird above the far bank began again, the single clear note it had been making before the disruption. She stayed in the water until the last sound had gone completely and the forest had closed back over the space where Actaeon had stood, until the far bank looked as it had before he arrived. The ferns undisturbed, the wet ground at the tree line already beginning to still. Then she waded back to the near bank. She picked up the silver bow from the flat stone, dried the grip against her tunic. The 12 were exactly as she had left them. No questions, no expressions she would need to answer. Cyrene had not moved from the flat rock upstream. The river continued past them all. Artemis stood with the bow across her shoulder and looked north along the bank, where the water followed the rock and the trees leaned inward from both sides, and the path, such as it was, continued. The path north followed the water closely at first. Then the river bent, and the path did not, and she moved through a stretch of open ground between the trees, where the light came down without interruption. Midday light, direct and warm across her shoulders. She did not think about what had happened at the pool. This was not suppression. It was not the careful setting aside of something difficult. It was simply that the event had already settled into its place inside her, the way a stone settles into soft ground. It had happened. The forest had absorbed it. The far bank was as it had been before he came, and the bird had returned to its note, and the pool behind her held the light on its surface again without any record of disruption. The 12 moved with her, spread loosely as they always were on open ground, keeping their own distances from each other and from her. Cyrene was to her left, slightly behind. She made no sound. None of them did. This was the particular gift of companions who had spent long years in wilderness together. They understood when silence was preferred and did not require it to be requested. The open ground gave way again to forest. Old trees here, wider than the ones downstream, their bark rough and deeply furrowed. The light came through them in a different way, more filtered, more broken. She walked through alternating bands of warmth and shadow, and did not feel the need to walk faster. Her mind, in these stretches, went where it wanted. She had noticed this over a very long time. That movement released thought in a way that stillness did not. Not grand thought, not the weighing of great questions. Small things, particular things. The way a specific morning had looked, the feel of certain ground underfoot. It went today to Delos. This was not unusual. Delos returned to her with some regularity, the way a place does when it is the first place a body has known. She had not been there in a long time as mortals measured time. Long enough that Apollo had been and gone many seasons, establishing himself at Delphi, taking up the work of the oracle and the lyre and all the bright business that was his. The island had been quiet when he left. She knew this without having seen it. She simply knew. She thought of what Delos looked like now, the small island, the pale rock, the particular flatness of it, how it offered itself to the sky without hesitation, no high ground to interrupt the meeting of sea and air. The palm tree still stood at the place where Leto had steadied herself. She was certain of this. Some things held. The palm was one of them. She had been born there in the very beginning, before any of her particular nature had made itself known, before the silver bough existed, or the 12 had names, or the forests of Arcadia had become known to her. She had simply been a new thing in a cold world, and the island had been cold stone and the smell of salt, and her mother's hands had been the only warmth. Then she had turned immediately to what needed doing. This was the part the old tale told in brief, as though it were only a detail. Artemis born first, Apollo still to come. The newborn goddess turning without hesitation to assist in her brother's birth. They said it as though it were simply a sequence of events. But she had thought about it many times in the long years after, and she believed it was the first true expression of what she was, not the bow, not the hunt, not the dominion over wild places and mountain passes and the cold hours before dawn. Those came later, gifts and choices and accumulated nature. But this, turning in the first moments of existence toward the work that needed doing, without being asked, without instruction, simply because it was there and she was capable of it, that had been the first thing. Apollo had gone south to Delphi. That was his nature. Toward warmth and light, and the questions mortals brought to oracles, the need to be answered, to have some brightness cast on the dark uncertainty of their lives. She did not fault him for it. That was genuinely his. Her own direction had always been different. Not toward the centers of things, but toward the edges. Not toward warmth exactly, though she knew warmth well enough. Toward the places where warmth ended and something older began. The tree line, the ridge above the valley, the hour when night still held and dawn had not yet committed to arriving. She walked north through the old trees and felt the afternoon settling into the early approach of its own later hours. The light changed, not dramatically, not yet, but the angle of it shifted by a small degree she could feel on the side of her face. The companions moved around her like water around stone. Cyrene had drifted further back. 2 of the younger nymphs, Phoebe and the one they called Nays for no name anyone remembered giving her, moved ahead through a gap in the trees and then reappeared further along the bank. Everything loose, everything unhurried. She thought again of the palm tree on Delos, whether anything grew beside it now, whether Leto ever returned there. Her mother had spent so long unable to rest, driven from every shore, the earth itself refusing to hold her before Delos agreed. It seemed right that Delos would remain open to her, that the island would remember what it had offered and hold that offering still. There was a comfort in this thought, quiet and without urgency, the kind that comes not from resolution but from continuation. The palm tree standing in the salt wind, the rock of the island warm in afternoon sun. The memory of birth still held somewhere in the stone. She was not sentimental about origins. She had seen enough of the world to know that beginnings were not always what they appeared in the telling, but Delos was the true beginning, before anything else had been decided, and, returning to it in thought even now, felt like pressing a hand against something solid, something that did not move. The river came back into view through the trees. It had widened here, flowing across flat pale rock in a thin continuous sheet before collecting again in a narrow channel. The sound of it was different over the flat rock. Lower, broader, almost inaudible. She stopped at the bank and looked at the water moving over stone. The 12 settled around her without instruction, not grouped, not arranged. Distributed naturally across the small clearing, some sitting on the higher ground, 2 standing at the river's far edge looking across. Cyrene came to stand nearby, not close but within easy reach of speech if speech were needed. It was not needed. Artemis watched the water cross the pale rock. The light on it was flat now, less golden than it would become in another hour. A steady, even light that showed the surface clearly without dramatizing it. The water moved with complete indifference to being watched. It had been crossing this rock long before she arrived, and would continue long after the sun moved on. This was the quality she had returned to again and again across all the years. Not the hunt, though the hunt was hers. Not the companions, though she was glad of them. Not even the wild places themselves, though she had shaped herself to fit them and they to fit her. The indifference of water. The way a river does not alter its pace for anything that stands in it. The way the forest closes over a disruption and becomes again exactly what it was. The way the world persists, unnarrating, continuing. She had been born on bare rock above a cold sea. She had turned in her first moments toward work that needed doing. She had asked for the bow and the wide mountains and the company of those who ran without tiring. She had been given all of it. The water moved over the pale stone. She stayed there until the light shifted again. Then she looked north, where the river continued along its own choosing, and she followed it. The river narrowed again past the flat rock, drawing itself back between two low banks of dark soil. The trees grew closer on both sides here. Their roots came down to the water in long, knotted lines, gripping the bank the way hands grip something familiar. Artemis walked along the left bank, where the ground was firm, and the canopy opened at intervals to show a strip of sky still carrying its afternoon colour. Pale, clear, unhurried. The 12 came behind her in their loose arrangement. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The river said enough. Her thoughts moved ahead of her feet, as they sometimes did in the late part of walking, not purposefully. Not with the focused attention of a hunter reading ground, more like water finding its own level, filling the available space without force. She thought of Iphigenia. Not the altar at Aulis, not the fleet standing breathless in the harbour, the sails hanging slack, the soldiers' faces turned upward as though the wind might come from somewhere above the masts. That was not where her thoughts rested now. She thought of Tauris, a far shore, the temple there. It was a cold place. She knew that without having stood in it the way a mortal stood in a room. The Black Sea coast in the early months was ice and grey stone, and a wind that came from somewhere further north than most mortals had names for. The temple sat on a promontory above the water. The stone of it was local stone, rough-hewn, not the refined marble of the great sanctuaries further south. It was a working place, a place for the necessary things. Iphigenia was there. The girl who had walked to the altar in white had become a woman who tended a cold fire in a cold country at the uttermost edge of the world her family had known. She was priestess. She performed the rites. She kept the temple. She did these things with the steadiness of someone who had passed through the extremity of one terrible moment and come out the other side into a life that was, by comparison, simply ordinary, cold, quiet, hers. Artemis did not dwell on the altar. She had made her choice there. The deer for the daughter. The substitution made in the last breath of the last moment. Some called it mercy. That was one word for it. She thought the girl had walked into an end and been given instead a continuation. That was perhaps the more honest way to hold it. Not rescue in the sense of triumph or reversal, but the opening of a path that had appeared to be closing. The altar was real. The knife was real. Iphigenia had understood this with the full clarity of a young person who had decided to accept what seemed inevitable. That clarity was not nothing. It was not a thing to be taken lightly or overwritten with a story about divine intervention arriving like a bright light from above. The deer had stood on the stone. The fleet had found its wind, and far away, on a cold shore no one in Aulis could have pointed to on any map. A young woman had arrived to begin the long work of her service. Artemis walked along the river and thought about that arrival. The first morning, the temple door, the smell of the sea coming through it, cold salt. Stone, the particular silence of a place that is waiting to be inhabited by purpose. Iphigenia would have stood in the doorway and looked at the water. That seemed right. The Black Sea in morning light, flat and grey, moving without hurry, not so different in the end from water moving over pale rock. The same indifference, the same continuation. There was something in this Artemis held carefully, the girl taken from everything familiar and set down at the world's far margin. Given not ease but function, the tending of the fire, the learning of the rites, the slow building of competence in a cold place. These were not the things that made for bright stories. They made for something steadier. The kind of life that accumulates quietly and asks nothing of outside witnesses. Cyrene moved up beside her briefly. Not to speak. She passed close enough for her shoulder to come level with Artemis's, and then she fell back again, returning to her place a little behind and left. It was acknowledgment without interruption. Artemis did not turn her head. The river curved. Through the trees on the far bank the light was lower now, coming in long flat lines that touched the upper trunks and left the ground below in a soft and even dimness. The roots at the waterline were dark. The water between the banks moved clear over a bed of small pale stones. Iphigenia had served for years, was perhaps still serving. The temple on the promontory, the cold work. The fire kept against the wind off the water. This was what it meant to be held by a goddess. Not a life of ease or illumination, not a constant brightness overhead. A life continued, a fire maintained. Artemis understood this. She had not given Iphigenia warmth. She had given her a place at the margin where the work was real, and the days were long, and the sea was always audible. In this she had given her something true. The same thing the wide mountains were, the same thing the pre-dawn hour was. A place where what was required of you was clear, and the world around you did not pretend otherwise. The trees opened briefly. A narrow meadow ran down to the bank, the grass pale and dry, and catching the late light along the length of each blade. Phoebe and Nace were already there, sitting at the meadow's lower edge with their feet near the water. They did not look up when Artemis came through. They were watching the river. She stopped at the meadow's centre. The light here was unbroken, direct, the afternoon finally committing to its own turning. She could feel it on her face and her arms. Warm still, not warm in the way of midday. Warm in the way of things giving off what they had gathered, releasing it slowly back. She stood in the open and let the thought of Iphigenia complete itself. The woman on the far shore, the temple, the grey sea visible from the doorway every morning, the fire lit against the dark each evening. A life at the edge of the known world, held in the attention of a goddess who understood edges, who had always moved toward them, who found in them not desolation but something more like clarity. The place where what a thing was could be seen plainly, without the softening interference of everything crowding in from either side. Claimed and held, that was the fullness of it. Not gently, perhaps, not easily, but held. The river ran past the meadow's edge, narrowing again between the far bank's roots. The sound of it was different here, brighter, more present. Phoebe said nothing. Nais said nothing. The light moved another fraction across the sky. Artemis remained in the open grass a little longer. Then she turned and looked north, where the trees resumed and the river continued under their shadow, carrying its cold water toward whatever country waited further on. The path north resumed without announcement. Artemis moved from the open meadow back into the shade of the trees, and the warmth of the afternoon light closed behind her like water closing over a hand withdrawn from a pool. She did not look back at Phoebe and Nais. They would follow when they were ready. The meadow would hold them a little longer, and that was a reasonable thing. The river narrowed here, the banks pressed closer, and the roots from both sides reached nearly to the middle, leaving only a band of clear current between them. The sound of the water changed with the narrowing. It moved faster over the pale stones. More friction, more brightness in the sound. Less the deep steady pull of open water, and more the particular music of water that has been given a specific direction and is committing to it. Artemis followed the left bank where the ground stayed firm. She was thinking about Orion, not with urgency, not with the quality of grief that requires attention and effort to manage. The thought of him came the way the thoughts of the dead sometimes come, quietly and without warning. Arriving beside a person, rather than striking them from the front, he had been the only hunter she had walked beside as an equal. Not as a goddess attended by her companions, not as a divine presence moving through the world with the arrangement of lesser things in her wake. Beside, shoulder to shoulder across the grey slope of a mountain at dawn, both of them tracking the same quarry, both reading the same ground. She had not walked that way before, she had not walked that way since. The scorpion had come from the earth. That was the oldest account of it. A creature born from the dark soil at the sea's edge, where the island dropped into deep water and the cliffs were sharp and pale. Orion had died on the rocks. The sea had taken him briefly and then given him back to the sky. She had not been present. That absence was its own particular weight. The trees here were older than the ones further south. Their trunks were thicker, the bark rougher, and their roots had gripped the bank for long enough that the bank had shaped itself around them rather than the other way. A small stream entered the river from the right through a shallow cut in the opposite bank, adding its cold voice to the main current, making the water turbid and pale for a moment before it cleared again downstream. That was the second thing she gave her attention to, the small stream, the brief clouding of clear water, the way the river absorbed the intrusion and continued without marking it. Orion had been placed among the stars. That had been decided by someone or something operating at a level she did not govern and had not been consulted about. He was there now, fixed above the winter sky, his belt bright, his posture, the posture of a man who has stopped walking and is simply standing, as though at the edge of a high place, looking across something wide. She had looked up at him since, on many nights, from many places, mountain ridges in Arcadia, the cold shore north of Delos, a hillside above Corinth where the air had been clear and the stars close. He was always at the same angle to the horizon, always occupying the same position in relation to everything else. There was something in this she had come to understand over time, not comfort exactly, not the softening of grief into something that no longer mattered, something more honest than comfort. A kind of location. She knew where he was. She could find him, and the hunter placed among stars was still, in some manner she could not fully articulate, the hunter. Still the figure who had walked beside her across the mountain at dawn, still the one whose footstep on the same ground she had recognized without needing to look. The sky kept him in a way the earth does not keep things. She had returned to her wilderness afterward. There was nothing else to do. The forests still had their cold mornings. The deer still moved through the grey pre-dawn through the tree line. The silver bow still rested in her hand with its familiar weight. These things did not change because Orion was gone from the world, and bright above it instead, a route crossed the path. She stepped over it. Behind her she heard the soft return of feet through grass. Phoebe and Nais rejoining the line. Then, further back, the quieter steps of the others, their presence distributed through the trees in the loose arrangement that the hunting band kept when there was no quarry and no urgency, only the moving through. The river bent left ahead. Through the tree trunks, the sky was visible at the bend, pale and wide, the last of the afternoon's warmth still holding in the upper air, though the ground was already cool beneath the canopy. A heron stood at the water's edge on the far bank, perfectly still, attending the shallows with the absolute patience of a creature that has no concern for time. Artemis slowed as she came to the bend. She watched the heron. It did not move. She thought Orion would have noticed the heron too. He had that quality, a hunter's attention that took in everything around the quarry as well as the quarry itself. He had read the world the way she read it. That had been the rarest thing. The heron struck, one clean motion into the water. It came up with nothing, stood again, resumed its attending. The river continued north. Artemis walked alongside it. The trees closed in again after the bend, the canopy thick overhead, and the light that reached the ground came in pieces rather than in the long flat lines of the open meadow. It moved gently on the forest floor as the upper branches moved. Somewhere above the canopy, above the pale afternoon sky, above the place where sky became the vast dark nothing that holds all visible things, a belt of 3 bright stars occupied their fixed position. She did not look up. She did not need to. She knew where he was. The river carried its cold water forward. The heron was already behind her, still and silent at the bend. The nymphs followed in their quiet arrangement through the trees. The world continued in the way that the world continues, indifferent and steady and full of its own attending. The story ends here, but the world of Olympus dreams continues. If these stories carry you towards sleep, follow the channel and let the next one find you. Sleep well.